Thank you for joining us for Academic versus Textbook Writing, Similarities and Differences, presented by Ken Campbell. Ken is a professor of history at Monmouth University, where he has taught a variety of undergraduate and graduate courses in British, Irish, and European history. He is the past recipient of Monmouth University's Distinguished Teacher Award. He has written a number of books, including The Beatles in the 1960s, Reception, Revolution, and Social Change, and History of Britain and Ireland, Prehistory to the Present. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Paul. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank everyone for attending my session this morning early on a Saturday. And I'm very happy and excited to be presenting at the conference. Again, I was just telling Paul and Kim how much I love this organization and how great it is to be a part of a community that cares so much and deeply and passionately about writing. And I just think that the sessions yesterday were awesome, and that I got so many good ideas. I always do, from TAA and from its resources and the conferences. And I hope you guys feel the same way. And I hope that my session today gives you some ideas that might help you in your work and in your writing. You know, Philip Lapate is an author who I like, who wrote a book called To Show and Tell, which is a sort of a different take on the old writing axiom of show, not tell. I'm going to try to do both of those things today. I'm going to try to start by talking a little bit about the differences and similarities between academic and textbook writing, talk a little bit about my experience and what I've learned from doing both. And then I'm going to risk things by showing you some samples of my own writing that I hope might illustrate some of the general points that I want to make about the differences and similarities. So before I get into all of that, Paul and I were part of a great discussion yesterday on Chat GPT and AI and the impact that it will have on writing and publishing. And there were a lot of concerns that were expressed. Some of you might have been there, but there were a lot of concerns expressed about what this might mean for us as writers. In fact, I almost see it as kind of an existential crisis that even affected me as I prepared for this presentation. After all, I thought, what can I tell you about the similarities and differences between textbook and academic writing? First of all, that you don't already know, because most of you probably know what the basic differences are, but also that you can easily find on Chat GPT. So I decided to talk about Chat GPT a little bit today, and less about what the differences and similarities between textbook and academic publishing are, and more about how we use that knowledge of those differences and similarities to make the transition from one to the other and back again, and in our writing of each, and how a recognition of those differences can actually inform our writing of both. So interestingly, this is a distinction that goes back to the ancient world in a way, in her really excellent book, Aristotle's Way, How Ancient Wisdom Can Change Your Life. Edith, in which she actually talks a lot about writing and teaching. So it's a really relevant book for us, in addition to for general life advice. But I thought it was really interesting that she points out that Aristotle gave a great deal of thought to the difference between the way a philosopher or scientist needed to address the general public and a trained academic audience, and was convinced of the equal status of both styles of discourse. Far from looking down on popularizing works, Aristotle actually wrote many himself. So I think Aristotle probably would have been a member of TAA if he were alive today, and I think he would have definitely approved of our mission and the value that I think you all recognize that both of them can serve for us. So, like I said, I was thinking about how I'm going to present the differences and similarities between textbook and academic writing. And what can I tell you that you couldn't get from ChatGPT? So I asked ChatGPT, what are the differences and similarities between academic and textbook writing? So let's start there for a minute, and then I'll expand. I'll talk a little bit about what that says. And I just need to move you guys over so that I can see my screen here. All right, so this is what it says. Academic writing. The primary purpose of academic writing is to contribute to the existing body of knowledge in a specific field. It involves conducting research, presenting arguments, and engaging in scholarly discourse. Textbook writing. Textbook writing aims to provide comprehensive and structured information on a particular subject, intended for educational purposes. It focuses on presenting knowledge in a clear and organized manner for students or general readers. Okay, so far so good, right? That all makes sense. Style and tone. Academic writing tends to be formal, objective, and precise. It requires adherence to specific style guides such as APA, American Psychological Association, or MLA, Modern Language Association, and often employs a scholarly tone with an emphasis on critical analysis and evidence-based arguments. Textbook writing. Textbook writing is typically more accessible and reader-friendly. The style is often less formal, with a focus on clarity and simplicity. Textbooks may include explanations, examples, illustrations, and exercises to facilitate learning. All right, so far, so good. That all makes perfect sense to me. Maybe to you guys too. Just a few more that ChatGPT had to say about this subject. Structure. Academic writing often follows a specific structure, such as an introduction, literature review, methodology, results, discussion, and conclusion. It places importance on logical flow, coherent organization, and citation of sources. Whereas textbooks generally have a structured format with chapters, sections, and subsections. They may include summaries, review questions, and other learning aids at the end of each chapter to help students grasp and retain the material. And finally, audience. Academic writing primarily targets an audience of fellow researchers, scholars, and experts in a particular field. The aim is to contribute to the scholarly conversation and advance knowledge in the discipline. Textbooks cater to a broader audience, typically students at various educational levels. They aim to provide a comprehensive understanding of a subject, often including foundational knowledge and introductory material. And then, interestingly, ChatGPT went on to add, while there are some overlaps between academic writing and textbook writing, such as the use of research and authoritative sources, their primary objectives and intended audiences differentiate them. Academic writing focuses on research and contributing to scholarly discourse, whereas textbook writing focuses on presenting knowledge in a structured and accessible manner for educational purposes. All right, so that's great, right? Now you all know the differences and similarities between textbook and academic writing. So what else can I tell you? Because if you know this, obviously you're well prepared now to go out and write an academic book or a textbook. And I know many of you have already done this or do this regularly. So, you know, you already know how to do this. So what does this really add? Well, I mentioned this is the third presentation that I've given to the TAA conference. And I don't know if any of you would remember my first one. Paul actually said he did, so I'm very flattered by that. But one of the things that I mentioned then is that one of the things that I like to do as a writer and a scholar is to regularly read books on writing. And I not only read books on academic writing or textbook writing, but I try to read books on writing in general, including books on fictional writing, because, and one of the presenters yesterday mentioned that she was actually making the transition from writing nonfiction books to writing her first fiction book. So you can learn a lot about writing, even if you're writing in a different style or a different genre. And that's why I love this, another reason why I love this organization is because even though we all come from different disciplines, we still all share a lot of the same values and principles when it comes to our scholarship and our writing. So one of the books that I recently read is a really great book by George Sanders, novelist and fiction writer. And his book is called A Swim in the Pond in the Rain. And it's a book that uses Russian short stories to actually provide guidance and instruction on writing better. And I loved this quote, and I thought it provided perfectly to ChatGPT, and the ChatGPT in the brackets I added there, right? So I thought this is what I would follow up what ChatGPT says. Sanders writes, but anyone can Google or ask ChatGPT how to hit a curveball and be informed that a hitter must identify the spin and hit the bad ones, but let the good ones go by, and so on. And we can all be yapping about that on our way to the batting cage, but once we get there, we'll find that nevertheless, some of us can hit a curveball and sorry, for some reason, my Zoom automatically mutes me every once in a while. So if you didn't hear anything what I just read the first paragraph. The difference between a great writer and a good one, or a good one and a bad one, Sanders writes, is the quality of the instantaneous decisions she makes as she works. A line pops into her head. She deletes a phrase. She cuts this section. She inverts the order of two words that have been sitting there in her text for months. And I would suggest that this is what makes us as human writers very different from ChatGPT, because ChatGPT, from what I've read and understand, I'm not an expert, but I've read a bit about it, does not actually think. It make conscious decisions. It predicts a sequence of words based on linguistic patterns in the database of information that it has. And so that's something that that is very different than what we do as human writers. And we take our time over it, and we make conscious decisions about what belongs in a paragraph, what belongs in a chapter, what belongs in an article, what belongs in a book, and what doesn't, and what the order of those words should be. And it takes practice, and it takes experience, and it takes years of learning. And I understand those who might be concerned. Well, is that all of that obviated by these artificial intelligence engines that can generate text instantaneously? And if you haven't used them yet, they really do generate just about any text on any subject in whatever style, literally, like practically instantaneously. I don't understand the science of it. Some of you might. I don't understand how it does it, but it's like magic. It's really amazing. But I think it's very, very different than what we do. And as I said, and I think what as Sanders is saying, we don't automatically know how to do something just because we know the definitions of what academic and textbook writing are. Fintan O'Toole, columnist in the Irish Times, whom I frequently read, wrote a recent column on ChatGPT, and I love this quote too. He said, I have to make choices about what I am going to write. And those choices are not the product of linguistic patterns, but of my values. And O'Toole's point was that if you ask ChatGPT to write a paper or write something on any subject, it's going to be very good at giving you the on the one hand and on the other hand, and it's going to show you different sides of an argument, but it's not going to take a stand. It's not going to take a position. It's not going to actually make an argument that is a product of the values that it has, because it has no values. It's artificial intelligence. As human beings, that's something that I don't see changing. And like I said, I understand those concerns of people who want to make sure that ChatGPT doesn't do everything for us, or artificial intelligence doesn't make decisions for us, because those decisions, and I would argue that includes when it comes to writing, those decisions ultimately come down to our values and what we think are important and what we have to say. So, like I said, this is kind of a little bit of an existential crisis that I think we're all trying to navigate through at the same time. And I'm kind of talking this through with you as much for myself, I think, as I am for you guys, although I hope what I have to say helps you in some way. So I thought, like I said, I'd provide a few examples and illustrations from my own writing, but first let me provide a little bit of my own experience and some of the things that I've taken away from the writing that I've done. So here's just images of a few of my books, and I suppose, like most of you, perhaps, I was trained as an academic historian and did academic writing, and it was some years into my career before I started writing textbooks, and I'd written 2 historical monographs and other articles and papers and things before I wrote my first textbook, and since then I've written 4 textbooks and edited 3 anthologies for classroom use, and recently published this book on the Beatles in the 1960s that I would describe as a kind of hybrid between an academic book and a textbook. It has all the scholarly apparatus one would expect of an academic book, but I wanted it to be suitable as a textbook for courses on the Beatles, or perhaps as a supplementary text for courses on the 1960s. So it's kind of structured more like a textbook and written so that students or non-academic readers would find it accessible. And so I thought that also would provide sort of a useful hybrid or crossroads for exploring the differences and similarities between academic and textbook writing. So I had to, so when I started to train, and this is what I kind of originally planned to talk about before I thought about the importance of ChatGPT to this subject, was for those of you who might be interested in making that transition from academic writing to textbook writing. And one of the reasons that I got into textbook writing in the first place was because I didn't particularly like to read textbooks on history. And I love history. So I thought, why not try to write a textbook that hopefully other people would find interesting, or that at least I would find interesting to write about, and that maybe hopefully other people would want to read it. I've generally gotten pretty good, feedback from reviewers and students, and all of that. But still, there is this real, kind of bias and prejudice out there against textbooks that I think is that is a little bit unfair and unjust. But I think at one time I kind of shared it. But I was in a department meeting this year, and one of my colleagues actually made the statement, no offense, Ken, but I hate textbooks. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know, if you read mine, if you hate that, or, but you just don't like to use them in your teaching or whatever. But textbooks are, going back to the quote from Aristotle, I mean, textbooks are a vital part of our educational system, of our structure. I don't think that we will ever abandon them. And so I feel like I've learned a lot from this process of doing academic writing and doing textbook writing and defending textbook writing and making that transition. So before I give you the examples that I said I was going to use to illustrate the differences and similarities, let me give you a little bit of what I learned, and maybe some advice that hopefully you might find helpful, whether you're making the transition or whatever stage you are in your writing career. And I think one thing that we probably all agree on, I know I've been doing this for a long time, and I still am working and interested in improving my writing and learning more. And again, that's why I love this conference so much. So for those of you who did come to this session because you were interested in making the transition from academic to textbook writing, here are some of the main points that I would make. And some of this also leads back to what I said earlier about ChatGPT. And the first piece of advice that I would give you is to find and follow your own voice. That even writing a textbook it's not just about finding and presenting information in as neutral a tone as possible. I would say don't try to imitate and maybe not even read other textbooks. And by that, I don't simply mean don't plagiarize, which of course goes without saying, but I don't think you even subconsciously want to try to imitate or adopt someone else's style just because you think that's the way a textbook is supposed to be written. I think even when you're writing a textbook, you want to let the reader hear your voice coming through on the page. And you still want to think of yourself as communicating directly with someone who might be reading your words or hearing your voice. So I think that that's really, really important. When I was working on my very first textbook, my editor was suggesting some changes that I make in style, and she said, Ken, your writing's too poetic. And I didn't know whether to take that as an insult or a compliment. I kind of took it as a compliment. So this is something that you might have to negotiate, with your editors a little bit, but and maybe there is a certain styles, guidelines that you definitely do want to follow as a textbook writer, but I would say that not at the expense of ignoring your own voice. Second piece of advice, especially when writing textbooks, and I forget if I used this in an earlier presentation because I use this a lot, so forgive me if I did, but Steven Pinker uses this phrase in his book on writing style in the 21st century. I forget the exact title of his book, but he's got a very, very good book on writing, in which he talks about what he calls the curse of knowledge. And this simply has to do with not assuming that your readers know more than they might about the subject that you're writing about. We can think as we're writing, and this I think applies to academic writing as well as textbook writing, even when we're writing for perhaps more experts in our field or scholars in our field, we might think that, oh well, everybody knows this or what, but you don't want to. You want to be careful about that. You want to make sure that you still explain your terms and don't and don't leave things out that are important just because you assume that that somebody is going to know them. So that's something that I just always have to remind myself about, and so I thought it might be useful to remind you all of how important this principle is. The third piece of advice that I have is to write to your strengths, to use your own specialized area of expertise and other strengths as an advantage in your writing. You might think when you sit down to write a textbook that, well, I'm writing this for a general audience. My other work is for other people, but you've got all of this in-depth knowledge and expertise, and it's not that you want a particular part of your book to be stronger than the rest of it. But if you have a particular specialty in your field, that's one of the things that could help make your book distinctive from other textbooks in the field, even as you don't neglect the other areas that you would be expected to cover. Just for example, my own experience, my early monographs were on English religious history. So I tried to make special use of that when I was writing my textbook, and placed probably a little bit more emphasis on religion in writing my history textbooks, maybe than other modern or contemporary writers do. I read a lot of literature. I've read a lot of novels, plays, poems. I use them in my classes. So my history texts probably, I think that they do it, and people have noticed this, and regard it as a strength that I that I include more references to literature and culture in my textbooks than I think a lot of history textbooks do. And like I said, my editors and my reviewers have generally praised me for that. So I really think that everything is grist for the mill. Part of this advice is kind of a version of of write what you know, but really kind of modified to don't neglect what you know and what you are expert at, even if you're writing a book for a more general audience, because that's something that you have to offer to the students and readers and the world. And that kind of brings me, and this is not my final point, but I would say that this is my main point, and it just really dovetails with these others, and that is to remember that, and especially this in terms of thinking about, well, should I even write a textbook now that AI can generate a textbook, or should I even write an academic article or an academic book when I can just ask AI to do that? And so I think this is so important to remember that you are unique. Each one of us is unique. No one in the world has the exact background, knowledge, and skills that you possess. No one's read the exact combination of articles, books, taken the exact combination of courses, taught the same combination of courses. Whatever your range of experience is, you are the only one who has it. And if you neglect to use that to contribute to the world and to contribute to your field and your students, then I think you're not only depriving yourself of the very, very valuable exercise of writing books or articles or whatever it is that you're writing, but you're depriving the world of what you have to offer, as the unique individual and expert that you are. Like I said, I don't think that that's something that will ever be replaced by artificial intelligence. And even if it were, and I don't think it would, but even if it were, the value of what we get from writing, it is so, many of you probably share, it is so satisfying. It is so fulfilling to be in a creative process and to have something that is a product of your own work and research and labor and skills and efforts in writing and making those kinds of decisions that Sanders talked about, and moving words around and putting things in exactly the way that you want, so that even if AI can do the same thing, they're not doing the same thing, I would say. And finally, my final piece of advice is to use TAA resources. For example, there's an excellent one from a few years ago called 5 Distinguishing Features of Academic Writing, that is easily accessible on the website, and they've all got all kinds of resources on the website. Seek out mentors. TAA does a great job of providing mentors at these sessions, and I've taken advantage of them myself. And then I don't know if any of you listen to Christine Tully's Defend, Publish, and Lead podcast. She's always promoting, TA is a sponsor of hers. She's always promoting it on her podcast. So I thought I would return the favor and promote her podcast at the conference, because it is really excellent. It's perhaps a little bit more geared, not always, not exclusively, probably a little bit more geared toward academics earlier in their careers and graduate students. But I've been doing this for more than 40 years, and I listen to it regularly, and I've gotten so many great ideas and so many insights about writing and about the writing life and the writing process. Just take advantage of the help and the resources that other people can give you along the way, because I would never expect you to, just like you wouldn't expect to ask ChatGPT how to write an academic or textbook, and then, okay, now let me go ahead and do it. I wouldn't expect that, oh, you're going to come to the session and now you're going to go away. And okay, now I know how to write a textbook or an academic, whatever. But so I think that's really, really an important part of writing textbooks and academic works, and making that transition is to continue to think about and learn from others who have done the same thing. So having said all of that, and I think we're doing pretty good with time, so I'm going to just share you a few examples from my own writing to illustrate and show you what I think the differences are between academic and textbook writing. And that shouldn't take me more than about 10 minutes or so, I think. And then that should leave some time for questions and discussion. All right, so here we go. First sample. And by the way, I chose these rather randomly, but I'm pretty pleased at the way they kind of fit together with what I wanted to illustrate. So this paragraph is the introductory paragraph to my chapter on the High Middle Ages in my Western Civilization textbook. And I'll just read it, and then I'll give you a basis of comparison. So Christianity and the Roman Church provided the unifying force that distinguished Europe from the rest of the world from the 11th to the 14th century, in the period known as the High Middle Ages. Christianity continued to evolve and expand during this period, while the Catholic Church made even greater claims to authority, power, and influence. Christian ideas about God and his relationship with humanity shaped the cultural vision of this period, while the Church played a dominant role in society and asserted itself in the political realm. During the same period, cultural, economic, and political achievements created a new sense of confidence among Europeans, especially among the ruling classes. Population growth and economic expansion went hand in hand and allowed more time for people to devote to education and cultural pursuits. This period saw the rise of cathedral schools in towns and cities and the creation of the first universities. New forms of literature, innovations in art and architecture, and brilliant achievements in philosophy were among the results of an educational and intellectual renaissance. The application of new ideas to politics created both stronger rationales for royal government, as well as the creation of new representative institutions. So I'll give you guys a chance to provide feedback later, but my own feedback about this would be to notice there's no assumed knowledge. It introduces the main points that the chapter will develop, but it's also constructed in a certain way. I think written in a certain style. I think this is a good example of my style of writing, and so I think you'll be able to see that when I give you this comparative introduction from a more academic piece that I wrote recently. And I couldn't fit this all on one slide, so this is going to go on two slides. In 1938, the Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce wrote, "When periods of barbarism and violence are approaching, it is only for the vile and the foolish that the ideal becomes unfreedom and slavery. For others, liberty remains that which alone can be called human, the only ideal which always works." Western Europe in recent years has witnessed the marked rise in the popularity of right-wing parties, many of which have gained entrance into legislative bodies. The Northern League has even become the dominant party and formed a government in Italy. The United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, used its influence to help force a referendum on Britain's exit from the European Union, the EU, despite limited electoral success. Nationalist parties have formed alliances. They hope to influence the policies of the EU. Throughout Western Europe, people have voiced dissatisfaction with their governmental institutions and evinced a strong distrust of politicians in general in a variety of ways. Has democracy lost its legitimacy in Western Europe in the 21st century because of its own inherent flaws? Or have its critics and opponents deliberately undermined it? Alternatively, have new technologies and social media, which make it easier than ever for people to communicate with one another, form groups and alliances, and express their views, enabled Western Europe to become even more democratic with a greater potential for citizen input into government than ever before. As the other chapters in this book, a chapter in an edited book, as you could say, as the other chapters in this book will no doubt make clear, these questions are not unique to Western Europe, but the goal of this chapter is to use the Western European example toward greater clarification of why so many people have perceived a crisis for democracy at this time in world history. So what I kind of noticed, and I didn't really think about this before I did this presentation, I wasn't consciously trying to imitate what I'd done elsewhere. But I think that this has kind of a little bit of a similar style to what was in my Western Civilization textbook. It introduces key developments and points that the chapter will develop. And that's the similarity. The difference, well, I start with a quote here. I raise questions instead of just stating main points. I hint at a more complex argument and engagement with a controversial topic. It's not as neutral. It implies certain values associated with liberty and the threat posed by authoritarianism. So I think that, I tried to write both clearly. I tried to not assume knowledge, but at the same time, I tried to make this, I didn't, like I said, not consciously, but looking back on it, I think that, maybe you can tell that I'm writing for a little bit of a different audience here than I was writing in the first passage that I shared. Then finally, I thought I would share with you 3 short passages from different writings on the Beatles. First from a textbook, the second from a scholarly article, and the third from my more recent book on the Beatles that I think represents a hybrid of the two. So I thought that might make it a bit of an interesting comparison to show the differences and similarities. And then I'll open it up to you guys and look forward to your questions and comments. All right. So this is an example of how I did write about the Beatles for my first edition of my textbook on the history of the British Isles. The Beatles, borrowing from American rock and roll, Motown and country and Western, as well as British skiffle and pop traditions, and on the strength of the brilliant and frequently poetic songwriting of Lennon and McCartney, created a unique, vibrant, and contagious sound. They polished their musical acumen through hundreds of live performances in the clubs of Liverpool and Hamburg. The Beatles, under the influence of their urbane manager, Brian Epstein, and benefiting from the experience, professionalism, and open-mindedness of their producer, George Martin, forged a new identity for themselves that shaped a generation. The enormous popularity of their early hits, such as I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You, created a tremendous following in Britain and the United States among young teenagers who grew up with and followed the Beatles through an evolution of their music and consciousness that lasted until the end of the decade. Okay, so this is a textbook. What makes this a paragraph from a textbook? No assumed knowledge, highlights key points, attempts to address a pretty broad topic in a single paragraph. It answers basic questions. Who were the Beatles? Why were they successful? What was their historical significance? It's not detailed, but it is precise, I think, in what it has to say there. This is from a journal article called "The Beatles at Woodstock" that was first published in Academic Journal, Popular Music and Society. So just a short passage from here. The White Album fueled the dystopian counter-narrative for Woodstock, largely because it pointed to the disintegration of the Beatles and seemed to reflect the radical wedge that had already contributed to the younger generation's growing alienation, notwithstanding the sense of hope and unity that Woodstock seemed to represent. It is perhaps no coincidence that Abbie Hoffman, the comic anarchist who was a disruptive force at Woodstock and an advocate of revolution for the hell of it, which is the title of a book he wrote, chose Dear Prudence from the White Album to describe the ethos of what he called Woodstock Nation. Hoffman used the lyric, "Hey Prudence, come out and play," I won't sing it for you, as a motto for Woodstock with its, quote, new culture with psychedelic wings and big ears for hearing sounds perched up on the telephone wires. Okay. So you see the difference, right? It's more specific. It ties into a more complex argument that I'm making in this particular article. And it makes connections beyond what I would do in a textbook. So that's academic writing. And then here's here's a paragraph from my book on the Beatles that, again, I kind of picked at random, but I think it works with what I want to illustrate. Astrid is about Astrid Kircher, who the young woman whom the Beatles met in Hamburg, who had such a big influence on them, and their music, and their dress and haircuts and everything. But anyway, Astrid found them magnetic while they found her refined, sophisticated, and yet mysterious at the same time. She certainly did not resemble the German groupies who typically frequented the Indra just looking for a good time. She knew about art and literature, or at least seemed to know much more than the Beatles did. Musically, her taste ran more toward classical and jazz than to rock and roll. Astrid's personal artistic sensibilities fit with the Beatles' new image. Her bedroom's color scheme included black walls, bedspread, and sheets. Gibson Kemp, Ringo's replacement on drums, and Roy Storm and the Hurricanes, who married Astrid in 1967, said she had a tremendous feel for shape and form, an unerring eye for the aesthetic, the unconventional, even the kinky, born out of a preoccupation to model herself after avant-garde left-bank intellectuals. So there's more, what I would say about this is there's more specific information than would be, that I would include in a textbook, but I still tried to write in an accessible style that would not be out of place in a textbook. So what do they all have in common? Layering of information, is what I would say. Layering of information. Each sentence builds on the preceding one to convey information and enhance an understanding of the topic discussed. That's what I think they all have in common. The key differences, I would argue, are less in style than in content. Textbook and academic writing should be clear and precise, but academic writing gives you the freedom to explore topics in greater depth, in the same way that you would not teach a topic in the same way to first-year undergraduate students and to graduate students. So I'm going to stop there. I hope you got something out of this, and be happy to spend the rest of the time taking questions or comments. And please feel free to follow up with me if you would like to ask questions or just have any this further discussion beyond what we talk about today. So thank you for attending my session. And I think I will stop sharing my screen so that I can see you all. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ken. If you have a question for Ken, please raise your virtual hand. You can also type your question in the chat and I will read those. There are a few questions that came up in the chat, Ken, and I think I'll start there and then I'll go to hands raised if any come up. So Stephanie Lennox had a question. She said, here's a question. As a textbook editor, I work with writers who are more familiar with academic writing than textbook writing. Some authors really resist what they consider dumbing down of their subject. Any advice on how to address this?
Well, that's a great question. And I've worked with enough editors now that I've come to appreciate, their perspective. And I think that, I think editors perform such a valuable service, and that I would advise authors to listen to your editors. And that doesn't mean you always have to do what they say if you really feel strongly about something. But I think I would just reiterate something that I said earlier, and that is to try to convey to them that clear communication is not dumbing down, and that you're naturally going to write differently for different audiences. Feel free to use Aristotle as an example of somebody, who did that. If it wasn't beneath Aristotle, why should it be beneath any of us, to think that we should, adjust our language and our, and the kind of information that we convey to make it more accessible to our readers. That's what our purpose is. That's what our goal is to be communicators. And Aristotle was very, very big on that. You know, with his book on rhetoric, it's all about you want to communicate clearly and effectively and make your case. And if you're talking over the heads of your audience, if you're talking over the heads of your students, or trying to write a text that for graduate students that you want first year students to read, it's just not going to work. You're not going to be effective. So those are the arguments I would use.
Thanks. Then Margaret Reese had kind of a comment and a question. It said, chat reflects the general belief that science is only for scientists. At least in medical science, the emphasis has been on translational research. I think Ken is talking about translating the science literature into textbooks. Am I correct?
Yeah, I try, even though I come at it from a history background and I use my own work as examples, I was really hoping that what I said would be relevant to people in other fields, and I think that makes perfect sense to me. I know that I'm not, I'm not a scientist. I did a graduate field in the social history of science. I'm interested in it, but even then, I wasn't. I didn't have anything beyond pretty much like introductory courses in science and in history. But we're all interested in science. It affects our lives. We read articles in newspapers and magazines all the time, probably about scientific topics. So I absolutely think that making scientific research accessible is a big part of what scientists can contribute. Surely you don't want to just be talking exclusively to each other. You want to have an impact on people and the world. And so I think making your scientific writings accessible to students and even to a lay public is very, very important.
Okay, as I kind of glance over the chat, there's a lot of positive comments and thank yous for your presentation. And there was some discourse going on in the chat, some good discussion, but I'm not seeing any other questions. Let's see. I have a person,
You see one hand raised.
346413. I don't see a name. If you could unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Hi, yeah, my name is Minette Dorsey. And I'm calling in from Houston, Texas.
Okay.
So my question is, my background is journalism, and we write in a conversational tone a lot. So is the conversational tone ever acceptable, welcomed when you're doing academic writing or textbook writing?
Great question. I think, if you actually, I was reading the TAA ebook on the principles of academic writing in preparation for this talk. And one of the questions that came up in that discussion, and I recommend it to you all, was whether or not academic writing was in the process of becoming more informal. And there does seem to be a fair amount of even quantitative evidence that that is true. That even academic writing is becoming less formal. It's more acceptable to use first person in your writing than it used to be. And so I guess I would say that. There's still probably a fine line or a balance that you need to strike. I don't think that probably it's going to depend, of course, on where you're being published and who your audience is and what the standards of a particular journal are or something like that. But I think that there's a kind of fine line that you probably don't want to cross in terms of being too conversational if you're doing academic writing. But I think that, just as I said earlier, I think that even as nonfiction writers, we can learn from fiction writers. I think that we can learn from journalistic writers as well. That I really believe that good writing is good writing, and you can adopt take what you can use from each, and then try to blend that into your own style. So I think that's how I would answer that question.
Okay, Renee.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm.
Hi, I wanted to piggyback on that because within the past few years, I switched my textbook for a general psychology class that used a really different model of having two community college professors and a journalistic voice into the textbook. And it really was the most successful textbook I think I've used. And it's actually the model if I go into a sub area of psych and develop a textbook that I wanted to use. So it's kind of interesting that this is coming up in the conversation, because I do feel like that textbook did something differently that students could really connect with. And it still was very academic and had all the citations, but there was just something a little more interesting and engaging, and having that sort of journalistic piece within the academic piece, I think was really helpful. So it'll be interesting to see if we do see more of that. I know that for me, I really liked seeing that kind of model.
Yeah, actually, Renee, and I don't have the reference right in front of me, but there is a book whose title I came across recently, and I was thinking about reading it and checking it out. I haven't gotten around to it yet, but I believe the title is something like A Conversational History of Modern Europe, or something along those lines. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And I bet that students would respond positively to something like that. And maybe that's something that we all might want to think about going forward as a possible model to engage more with students. And it also would make it more individualistic and personal, that would make it distinctive from what they would get out of, or what they could learn from Googling a subject, or just typing it into chat GPT. But yeah, no, I like the idea very much.
Cheval has her hand up. If you could unmute yourself, Cheval.
Yes, hi, thank you, Ken. I just wanted to, and I'm nervous because my heart is just beating. I'm just gonna just say this first, because I'm commenting on the first two pieces of your writing you shared, and I so appreciate. I mean, you're touching on subjects of God and religion, politics, things that many of my colleagues don't dare touch because they're so sensitive. And you so beautifully express rhetorical situations. You just give the facts. And you don't alienate any readers, anyone, no matter what religion they are, or even if they believe in God or not, no matter what their political affiliation is, would be able to read your writing and get so much out of it. You don't offend. And I just think the type of writing you're creating is so important, approaching it that way, especially today. You're talking about things like the application of spiritual principles to the material world, the impact of, religious groups on society, and you're not afraid to go there. So I just applaud you and appreciate you, and keep writing. And this is coming from an English professor from Grand Rapids Community College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So
Well, I don't know what to say. Thank you so much. That's so nice.
Karen has her hand raised. We're in about the last 5 minutes. So go ahead, Karen. If you could unmute yourself, Karen.
I
You can unmute
Yeah.
yourself, Karen.
I think I'm unmuted. It
Yeah, I can hear
looks
you,
like I
Karen. Yeah.
am. Can you
Yeah.
hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
I'm free.
Yeah, I can hear you, Karen.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Very good.
Yes. Yes.
Returning back to the audience, first off, I'm humbled by the last comment. So this is going to be very specific. One of the niche areas that I have found in my textbooks is the student who struggles. And so I may be dumbing down information, but my goal is to take that group of people and raise them up to that scholarly level. And I have found a very successful market. I mean, I am successful at what I do. I have adequate royalties and everything else. So I would encourage people to really think about that student who's struggling with the topic and write to that group as well. And also considering the amount of anxiety that students have returned to college with post-COVID, there is a serious market for people getting a helping hand up to what we used to call scholarly textbooks. And so that's it, just a comment about that. And then have you had any experience with taking one textbook and flipping it to a complete different audience? Like instead of a history major, it switches to political science or something like that?
Well, I think the piece that I read from on democracy is actually in more of a political science. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's really more. It's edited by two political scientists, and it's, I think, aimed more at a political science audience than a history audience. So that's and I also have a new in a new volume that the same editors did. I wrote a chapter on the responses to COVID and the impact of the pandemic on politics, a comparative study of Britain, France, and Italy, and how they responded to the pandemic. So yeah, I have a little bit of experience, I guess, in trying to write for a different kind of disciplinary audience than what I ordinarily do for history. And I think that I tried to use the same principles that I tried to elaborate on today in terms of how I wrote those pieces, and I so probably used a little bit of a different language, but I don't know that I really use much of a different style or approach in terms of in terms of doing the research and organizing the material and trying to lay it out in a clear and accessible way. And hopefully, again, in a way that doesn't offend too many people, but at the same time doesn't it doesn't deny my own values. And I do think that, and I so appreciated Shawal's comment earlier, that at the same time that you don't want to offend people who are religious or have a particular political or religious background, you don't want to exclude people who don't feel that way, and you present a perspective and you allow people to draw their own conclusions, and that's I think that's the ideal. I don't know if we always reach it, but I think that's the ideal.
Well, we have run out of time, so I'd like to thank Ken for a wonderful presentation and thank everyone for participating in this